All right, let's see how this is going. Let's see if everything sounds the way it's supposed to sound. And if it does, then we will get the show going. Okay, I think that's good. I think it sounds good on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. Let's check the other spots. Okay, stream is good. Let's go ahead and share this on ye old Twitter. And once we give it a share, we will continue the show. I'm going to copy this, minimize that, go over here, and we're going to see what happens, all right? Here we go, just a second. Okie dokie, so the link, she is posted. And because the link is posted and everything is sounding okay, we are just going to go ahead and get cracking and see what happens. And whatever happens is whatever happens, and that's the way we like it here on UnShrink Me. So happy Saturday, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I am Dr. Patrick Lockwood, technically just Patrick for the purposes of this podcast, so please don't sue me, fire me, whatever, but feel free to cancel me if you like. This is UnShrink Me. And for those of you who are brand new, UnShrink Me is simply just a weekly podcast about topics related to psychology, clinical psychology in particular, neuroscience, mental health, etc. Because what I have noticed in my career and in my personal life is that there are so many people, often well-meaning people, who either believe pseudoscientific nonsense or who are attempting in a very well-meaning way to be of support to people, but don't have the correct foundations or understanding of various topics in mental health. So this podcast is actually for specifically the consumers of mental health services. So this is for the general broader public. This is not one of those talk and shop podcasts where me and people that are smarter than me get together and talk about ideas. This is just me ranting about what is accurate and not accurate. And then occasionally some of my colleague friends will show up and viewers will show up and chat and share things, and that's awesome, and that's exactly what I hope for. So in many ways, this conversational podcast will happen. In other ways, it's just ranting. So sometimes conversation, sometimes rant. But the main goal is to help the consumers, the broader public, become more well-informed about what is generally useful, what is generally scientifically sound in the field of clinical psychology, psychiatry, etc., and what is not. So that everyone who's out there who needs help can get better help from the services that they're attempting to consume. Right? So if you're seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist, are you getting the most out of those services? And how would you know if you're getting the most out of those services? And what does a quality professional actually look like? And I have both a lot of clinical experience as a supervisor, as a professor, as a consultant, whatever, to help people. And so I'm trying to bring those experiences to this podcast in a consumer-friendly, non-jargony way so that we can all benefit from the services that people need if they're needed. Okay? So that's the spirit of UnShrink Me. Thank you so much. Please like, share, and subscribe if you find this interesting or even useful. And we will try to help more people get better help from the services they're attempting to take advantage of, hopefully. Today's podcast is going to be interesting, I think, because we need to talk about men, unfortunately. And we also need to talk about the American Psychiatric Association, because they just put out a very ridiculous statement that I think is going to turn people away from getting the help that they need. So I'd like to talk about at least those two topics, if not a couple other things. And as always, for those of you who are brand new, this podcast is not, N-O-T, not sponsored by Celsius. However, I love this stuff. I think it's great. I don't know if it's killing me or if it's making me better, but I love the caffeine and the taste. And so this is a caffeine-informed podcast. So without further delay, let's get into the topics of the day. So before I get into men and before I get into the American Psychiatric Association, let's talk about a couple of the lower hanging fruit podcast topics that I always talk about. Let's talk about Dr. James Davies first. So I've talked about him a few times. He made a post a couple of weeks ago that I would like to briefly talk about because it's a nice segue into the American Psychiatric Association's bullshit. So we'll get there in just a second. But let's talk about his tweet first. So let me retweet this right now so everyone can see what I'm talking about. Okay. Here we go. So Dr. Davies, his handle is at jdavies, Davies, PhD. Anyways, he said about 2 weeks ago that psych knowledge is not independent of professional and economic interests. In fact, it's fundamentally constituted by them. For example, the endless parade of speculative theories as to why SSRIs really do work, and the ensuing cacophony of explanatory references in papers and conferences. So I want to just start this podcast this week with his post in particular because it's going to nicely lead us into the conversation about the American Psychiatric Association. So here's the truth. I think that what he said can be read or interpreted as on the more scandalous side of things. And I understand that he sometimes falls into the category of like anti-psychiatry critics, etc. And so I'm not here to necessarily fight that particular fight or whatever. But what I do want to emphasize that I think is valuable for this conversation is the idea that there's some independent, perfectly objective and neutral knowledge base that clinical psychologists like myself, psychiatrists, whatever, have access to. So that's a fantasy. And if you believe that one, I've got some other stuff to sell you, right? So it's definitely correct, technically speaking, that the psychiatric clinical psychology literature, those two literatures are not magically separate from both professional interests, which I'll try to describe here a little bit, and financial interests. So it is perfectly reasonable and understandable to believe that in order for a profession to survive, it has to have proof that it's valuable, either in a capitalistic sense or in just a practical sense, like I actually help people. And so it's extremely important that when you're running a business of any kind, that you have proof that what you're doing is useful. So I don't have any problem with any professional or any industry trying to sell their industry. You should be selling something, essentially, if you're good at it, right? Or you should be selling something if you think it's helpful, right? That's not weird or antisocial or Machiavellian or some shit like that. It's just normal. However, on the, let's say, conspiratorial side of things, one has to wonder, which I think is what Dr. Davies is talking about, is to what degree do these institutional authorities like the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Psychiatric Association have some grifter-like relationship with the public? And it's really hard to say with certainty because I'm not inside those board meetings, so I have no clue what the inner workings of those things are. I imagine, I can fantasize that they work like most nonprofits and professional organizations where it's like, oh shit, everyone hates us now. Let's make sure we are proving that we're, not bad. I'm sure that's part of their dialogue. But also, imagine if what they published was just all the negative trials, all the trials that said, no, meds didn't work, therapy didn't work. Of course, there'd be lots of skepticism. So there's a normal self-serving bias that all professionals have to confirm that what they're doing is working. Not weird, not strange. I think very few people actually tell the whole truth. And so the anti-psychiatry folks like Dr. Davies also aren't telling the whole truth by saying it's mostly flim-flam and stuff like that. So I think as a reasonable adult, it's fair to say there are some economic interests and there are some professional interests when people publish positive trial results. Like ACT certainly works for depression. ACT certainly works for OCD. DBT is great for borderline personality disorder, etc. I think when authority figures or institutions say that, it's for both pro-social and self-serving reasons. And that's not weird. We shouldn't find that strange, I think. So what I would argue, theoretically at least, is if you're like frustrated that any professional organization is going to do these self-serving or economically serving things, then I don't know how you intend to make money as a professional. But beyond even that, I think if you genuinely believe that the literature is so corrupted by economic or self-serving interests, then I don't know how else people would be motivated to publish. Like, most people are not publishing research out of the goodness of their heart. They're publishing because they have some kind of particular goal, usually at least. So I think Dr. Davies, I don't know what your expectations are for any functional business or organization would be. The question just becomes, are they complete grifters or not? And I don't believe that they are. As much as I don't like these big organizations personally, I believe that they probably serve some valuable purpose as gatekeepers of a sort. So I think we shouldn't throw the whole baby and the bathwater out. That would be a bad idea, I think. Speaking of which, let's turn to the American Psychiatric Association for our next topic, because I think this is the one that, you know, it's going to get a little messy. So bear with me, and I'm going to try and talk about something a little complicated. I'm not going to dig into like psychopharmacology, so we're all clear. But just so everyone knows, I've been teaching psychopharmacology for master's level students and greater for the last, I think, 4 years or 5 years. And so because of that, I do have some special relationship to the concept of psychopharmacology above and beyond the average clinical psychologist, because I've been teaching about it. So I have a lot of insight about what the literature actually says compared to the average skeptic or critic. So a lot of what I'm going to say might sound a certain type of way, but I promise you it's not meant to be completely anti-psychiatry. So I think it was earlier or later yesterday. I don't know if it was yesterday or today. But anyways, I'm going to retweet something that I posted right now about the American Psychiatric Association. Just give me a sec. Okie dokie. So earlier today, I think, if you wanted to be supported by all professions, you would remove the talking points, completely remove overly broad and unscientific phrases such as safe and effective. Be precise, as scientists do, about the types of meds which are safer or less safe, for what groups they are safer or less safe, and effective in what scenarios. So what's that in rebuttal to? So let's look at what the American Psychiatric Association put out yesterday. So it's always interesting when the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, puts out like an institutional authority post, because you never know what prompts them and motivates them. So here's what they said yesterday from their official account. They said, this is in quotes, important in all capitalizations, decades of rigorous research. Point number one, decades of rigorous research, randomized controlled trials, peer-reviewed studies, meta-analyses, national registry studies, and FDA oversight show that psychiatric medications are safe and effective. Medications like SSRIs can be life-saving if they are taken as directed under the care of an appropriately licensed healthcare professional. Learn more, link to a website of theirs. Okay, so I want to walk through this tweet real quick again. So they basically make two different statements. They make a broader statement, which is psychiatric medications are safe and effective as evidenced by all these different types of research that have been done over the past 60 years. That's number one. The second statement they make specifically is about SSRIs, which is medications like SSRIs can be life-saving if they are taken as directed under the care of an appropriately licensed healthcare professional. So both of those statements are scientific statements, right? They can be evaluated by looking at the research and critically analyzing the research, right? A mountain girl says, that post was all over X yesterday. Yeah, I know, it still is. People are still talking about it. That's why I'm talking about it, because I think it's relevant, right? Like, let's talk about each of these statements in turn. So the first clause of this sentence or of this post is actually not technically true. So let's be clear. In the psychiatric research, there exists a variety of different types of studies, including what they described here in their post: randomized controlled trials, peer-reviewed studies, which I don't know specifically what that means compared to randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, national registry studies, and then FDA oversight, which is somehow separate or interestingly different than these other things. So let us be abundantly clear about all the problems with their post, because I want to talk about the problems first, then I want to talk about what is good, right? So problem number one is that the idea that most of the psychiatric literature is rigorous is silly. It's 100% the truth that the variation in the quality of clinical trials is all over the map. If you read meta-analyses about psychiatric drugs, most of the meta-analyses show that there's low to moderate quality of these studies. Most of them are not high quality studies. It's a lie to say that if you look at 15 different meta-analyses about psych meds, you're going to find that most of them are high quality, whatever the grading scale they're using to determine quality. Most of them are low to moderate. So most clinical trials using psych meds, and I'm saying this because I teach about this, most clinical trials using psych meds are low to moderate quality. Now, does the fact that most quality controls are low to moderate mean that psych meds are bad and should never be used? No, that's not what that means. But what I'm critiquing is the outright lie, literal lie, when they say decades of rigorous research. Now, rigorous is such a broad word that they're not using the specific language of quality evaluation when you're evaluating papers, like to create a meta-analysis, right? And so just to be very crystal clear, let me describe to you one of these processes. So there's the criteria that are used. Okay. Prisma, Prisma. So Prisma is one of the most commonly used types of rating or assessments for the quality of clinical trials. And so if you were to use Prisma guidelines to look at most psych meds and psych med trials, most of them are low to moderate quality. Some are high quality. So I don't know what the exact percentages are. I don't have that data off the top of my head. I'm not a super genius or whatever, but it's definitely the case that it's not like 60% are all high quality. So the APA kind of lied in the very first clause of their post. They said rigorous research, which is more or less not true, right? Then they said randomized controlled trials, which is absolutely true. There are so many RCTs for all the different types of psych meds. Very few psych meds have very few RCTs. There's a lot of non-randomized trials, and then there are some non-controlled trials, but there's actually a lot of RCTs. So that's the truth. There's dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed studies that support the efficacy of psychiatric medications. So they didn't lie about that, okay? And then they said FDA oversight that shows psychiatric medications are safe and effective. So if you believe that the FDA is ensuring quality and safety, then I've got some stuff to sell you. Like, it's just, there's no way that you can trust the FDA to be the final arbiter of safety, given their track record of letting people die in various clinical trials and all this stuff and things that make it on the market that should never have made it on the market. So like that clause about the FDA and the clause about rigorous are both lies. It's propaganda. So that is what is not correct about the APA statement. Now, when you look at that next statement, the second statement they make, which is, for example, SSRIs can be life-saving if they are taken as directed under the care of an appropriately licensed healthcare professional. So let me underline and bolden this statement. I completely agree, both based upon the data and my professional experience for the last 15 years, before grad school, during, and after, that literally speaking, if psych meds are used correctly, people can not die, which is awesome. Because there are so many psychiatric conditions where impulsivity is a problem, or suicidal ideation with suicidal intent is a problem, or self-harm, or excessive drug use. There's so many conditions which are literally life-threatening in the world of clinical psychology. And so that statement that medications like SSRIs, if they're under the care, if a person prescribing them is actually taking care and monitoring things collaboratively with you, it can be life-saving and life-changing in a good way. So I know that the anti-psychiatry folks aren't going to like what I'm saying, but let me be abundantly clear as a reasonable professional and just a reasonable person, I think, which is meds are necessary for some people. Some people absolutely will benefit from everything from SSRIs to antipsychotics to mood stabilizers, and in the rarest of cases, like benzodiazepines, even though those things are garbage. And so, like, I think they hurt people more than they help people, in my experience. But, like, it's really important. It's extremely important to not just throw the baby out with the bathwater just because people do get hurt by shitty healthcare professionals. There are many, many psychiatric nurses, psychiatrists who don't give a shit, and shame on them for being shitty at their job. Maybe they're shitty because they're burnt out. Maybe they're narcissists. Maybe they just want to get rich. I don't know what it is. Whatever the cause is, you fucking suck and you're hurting our profession. But the truth of the matter is that there are actually so many good people. So let us not despair and think that all of psychiatry and all of clinical psychology is bad just because there are legitimately bad apples who hurt people. Like, we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we do that, people will actually die. That doesn't mean that psych meds are all glorious and amazing. That's called black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking. And the anti-psychiatry folks are really prone to black and white thinking, just like the pro-psychiatry folks, whatever, if that's a fair dichotomy, are also prone to black and white thinking and not being honest about the problems in the profession. So I'm telling you in the most reasonable possible way, without being alarmist or drastic or whatever, that the APA statement is terrible for like 2 or 3 reasons and great for that very last sentence. People can actually have a great quality of life if they are appropriately monitored by a healthcare provider who actually gives a shit, who knows what they're looking out for, who understands what mental illnesses actually are and how to help people long term. People's lives are changed. I have seen it firsthand many times in 15 years. Are some people overprescribed? Absolutely. Are some people on meds longer than they probably should be? Absolutely. Are some people's lives saved? Absolutely. Would people go out there and die of overdoses if they didn't have meds like Suboxone or something? Absolutely. Right. Mountain Girl says, Patrick, I and many anti-psychiatry folks totally align with this balanced perspective. Awesome, that's good. I hope there are millions of us out there who are trying to be reasonable. And it's the reasonable people that just need to have a voice, not the polarized people on the sides. Screw the sides. Let the reasonable middle have the most possible power. So dear American Psychiatric Association, I don't give a shit if you want to come after me or whatever. Everything I said is scientifically very valid from the point of research methodology and synthesis, etc. It's insane to say that you have rigorous studies when you have lots of not rigorous studies. In fact, at least 50% of them are not particularly rigorous because they're either not controlled or not randomized. And so let's be very clear that there's lots of not rigorous psychiatric research. And that doesn't mean you should throw it all out. That just means that you should look at it skeptically and think reasonably about what the implications actually are because it's not so rigorous. That is what adults who are scientifically literate say. Okay? Jonathan says, hard agree on benzos. I worry about ketamine. Yeah, of course, me too. But I'll, of course, reserve judgment until we get a little further down the road with it. I think ketamine, for instance, is going to be interesting because if ketamine is used in a very limited way for short-term situational circumstances, I bet it'll be helpful. I bet because like the research I'm aware of on ketamine right now, again, not my specialty, but I've read a lot of it. And it looks like, for the most part, especially if you read the meta-analyses, short-term efficacy, not long-term efficacy. So short-term stabilization of severe depression, but not long-term remission. So is ketamine going to be helpful? Yes. Just like TMS. Like, I'm really excited for TMS because it's pretty low risk in terms of its consequences to patients. It might be expensive or whatever, but I think that, like, will it actually help long-term? Maybe. We don't fully know yet, but it could be helpful and it could take the burden off of, psych meds, for instance, which would be interesting, right? So I'm open to both ketamine working and TMS working. I just have no clue what it's actually going to look like long term because these are newer things, newer technologies in terms of their specific application in psychiatric circumstances. All right. And Jonathan says, conservative prescribing with honest claims is best prescribing. Absolutely. Which is, I know a number of psychiatric professionals out here in LA that actually do that. So I'm excited to see what the future holds for both meds and for non-medical psychiatric interventions like TMS and things like that. So long as we're being very cautious about how we rate our optimism in all these kinds of things. But again, shame on the APA for using words like fucking rigorous or safe and effective because so many psych meds are actually not safe. And that's not some weird anti-psychiatry talking point. Like lithium is literally terrible for your internal organs. It's terrible for your kidneys. It's terrible for your liver. So you have to get your blood drawn to monitor it. That everyone knows that in psychiatry and in medicine. However, lithium is also extremely effective for managing psychotic disorders, bipolar disorder, and even severe depression. So on the one hand, lithium has all these toxic consequences. On the other hand, it's also very effective. And so having an honest conversation about what the literature actually says about these substances should be uncontroversial and ethical. That's what I do when I teach psychopharmacology to my master's students. So anyways, come at me, APA, and maybe refine your language so you don't look stupid. All right, let's move on. I'll save that. All right, let's talk about Dr. Roger McFillin. Good old Roger. So I'm going to repost this so we all know what I'm talking about. By the way, thank you to all you here chatting and hanging out. Love to hear you, or at least see you here, not hear you. Keep chatting. Let's keep talking. Okie dokie. Roger at DRMCFILLIN. That's his handle. 5 days ago, he said, therapy can be harmful. It's fascinating how therapists can continue justifying more sessions as the therapist keeps the client in a thought process / energy state / ruminative experience that brought them into therapy in the first place. So let's talk about this, because this is one of those fascinating problems that good clinical supervision should be able to solve if good clinical supervisors are available in your area. I try to do this as a supervisor. Maybe I'm not the best supervisor, I don't know, but I try to do this. So let me reiterate what he's saying and try to steelman it and then critique it, okay? So he said, just to reiterate the quote, therapy can be harmful. Of course it can. Of course it can. That's not complicated. He said, it's fascinating how therapists can continue justifying more sessions. So the problem he thinks is more sessions, number one, as the therapist keeps the client in a thought process / energy state / ruminative experience that brought them into therapy in the first place. So let's talk about those two different things separately. Even though they're related, those are technically two different things. More sessions is one critique, but number two, the therapist keeping the patient in that thought process is a separate problem, okay? So let's first talk about the problem of more sessions, which I've spoken about before on this podcast. So again, for the sake of informing consumers, there is no definitive statement in the psychiatric or psychological literature about how many sessions is perfectly helpful for a particular clinical problem or combination of clinical problems. So there is no magic number. I know that there are some very short-term studies where people use CBT for 4 sessions for anxiety disorders and depression, and it shows some benefit for people. There are also moderate term, middle ground research that's 3 to 6 months, which shows that in those 3 to 6 months, substantial symptom reduction for major mental health conditions like MDD, GAD, PTSD, etc. And then there's even some longer term studies using psychodynamic and other things, or DBT, which is a year and a half if it's done appropriately according to protocol, that helps with very severe psychiatric issues in some cases. So depending upon the particular issue or the combination of clinical issues and the psychosocial context of the patient, family support, economic support, psychiatric prescribing, physical health, all these things, therapy will be longer or shorter. So I just rattled off 10 different variables, which will determine the amount of sessions that might be helpful. And so there is no perfect way of knowing how many sessions will help a patient or a family or a couple with their clinical issues. I wish there were. I wish it were meds for a cold or a virus where it's take your antibiotic for 7 days and then you're good to go. It'd be awesome if it was that simple. But thinking of psychiatric issues or clinical psychology issues like an infection is silly, because it completely eliminates dozens of important contextual, cultural, and biological variables that don't respond to therapy directly. So because people are complicated and systems are complicated, family systems, social support, culture, how much money you have, how much sleep you're getting, what your diet's like, what your exercise is like, all these things affect your mental health, literally. And so ACT, CBT, DBT can't really influence those variables, for instance. I mean, they can to some degree, but that's not the specific focus of those therapeutic modalities I just listed, for instance. So anyone who pretends that I have this 16-week protocol and then you're fixed is full of shit. Because mental illness is not something that magically heals in 16 weeks. Yes, you can certainly get some therapeutic benefit after 12 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever it is. That's technically true. We have research that confirms that and supports that. But does that therapeutic benefit last long term is a question mark, because it varies for different groups of people. So that's a very, very long-winded way of saying, dear Roger, I don't know who you've talked to or who's advertising what, but who knows how many sessions are technically needed? When you do informed consent with patients, you can't perfectly know how many sessions you're going to use. Even though IPT, interpersonal therapy, says, we're going to try and keep this time limited. We're going to try and do maybe 12, maybe 16 sections. Maybe. We're going to try and keep it to that because we're going to try and keep it time limited so that there is a beginning and end. And if you need to come back, we'll do it again. But we're going to try and keep it time limited so that you can have some end in sight. So there's a philosophy of therapy backed up by research that says if there is an end in sight, it creates healthy pressure to achieve things in therapy, right? There's normal social pressure to get the job done, and that's not bad. Now, there are other authors and theorists who probably hate that. But there's a utility to that because some people need that. There's an entire solution-focused worldview that thinks that way too. So that first sentence of Rogers, I don't know what the hell he thinks or maybe he's trying to rail against CBT or against the psychoanalyst who's here for 15 years because that's how long it takes to heal your fucking attachment issues or whatever. But that's not most people. Okay? Also, is it this idea that you should be a paid best friend for people as therapists? That's terrible too. Do not see patients forever. That's stupid. That's just you being a narcissist or something. So I have some sympathy for what Dr. McFillin is saying. Now let's look at the second point because it does intersect with the first point. Okay, so the second thing he said, as the therapist keeps the client in a thought process, energy state, ruminative experience that brought them into therapy in the first place. So that's phrased very specifically. He's making it seem like therapists are these Svengalis who are manipulating their patients into feeling a certain type of way. So to the people that are naive to how therapy works, that sentence sounds perfectly correct, right? If your therapist is a bit of a narcissist, or if your therapist is very authoritative and authoritarian in their orientation, they will try to control you. And there are some therapists like that. And those therapists will try to make you feel something like a magician tries to make you shocked and deceived while they're doing something over here under the table to deceive you, right? So there are magician therapists, is what I will say. And unfortunately, there are too many of them. So maybe that's what Roger is talking about. However, ethical therapists are not, quote unquote, trying to make you feel anything, right? So ethical therapy is a collaboration between two or more parties who consent openly to a change process, which means that the patient is supposed to fully understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, if you're doing it ethically, because that's what informed consent is. So if you have a Svengali therapist or a magician therapist, they're going to do a bunch of shit to you to make you feel something. But if you have an ethical therapist, they're going to have an informed consent conversation with you and explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, and you have the choice of saying no at any time. The best example of this, which completely contradicts what Roger is saying, is this: exposure therapy, or ERP for OCD. When you're doing a type of exposure therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder, you are trying to intentionally help the patient feel overwhelmed so that they can learn to tolerate distress. It's exposure plus response prevention. That's what ERP stands for. And so the idea is the patient is voluntarily, with fully informed consent, in a very limited and controlled way, experiencing this exposure with you in a time-limited, with parameters kind of way, exposure to an overwhelming stimulus to learn how to tolerate the feelings of overwhelm and then not compulsively respond to feeling overwhelmed like they do in obsessive compulsive disorder. And so in that case, the therapist and the patient are both fully aware of the goal, which is to have this exposure experience where they feel terrible together. And as the patient learns to tolerate the distress, then we prevent the response and use healthy coping skills to manage once their SUDs have decreased to like a 5 or 4, whatever, right? And so it's really important to be clear that good clinical psychology and psychiatry is about helping patients understand their process and learning to tolerate more and more distress with their own resilience and skills. not keeping people in a state of trauma forever, because to Roger's point, the maladaptive version of what I just described is where you've got this trauma therapist, which is many people nowadays, who just are like these voyeurs. There are a lot of therapists who are psychodynamic or whatever. It doesn't even matter what the background is. But these are people who are not fully aware of their countertransference and their narcissistic desire to be voyeurs about patients suffering, maybe because of your own suffering you can't tolerate as a therapist. Who knows why, but there's various reasons that very unethical or uninformed professionals will become voyeurs, and they will stare at the suffering of another person. Maybe they're a little sadistic. Maybe the therapist is a little sadistic or a little narcissistic or whatever it is in their orientation personality-wise, and they're not aware of it. Because most therapists, by the way, are not super aware of how they're organized, which is really depressing. Because with good supervision, you can know how you're organized. Word to the wise, dear consumers of therapy, counseling, and psychiatry, you should be able to ask your therapist how they understand themselves. You can even ask them about countertransference and how they handle their feelings. Maybe they'll tell you something useful, or maybe they'll be a fucking mess. Who knows? But what I'm here to tell you specifically is that quality professionals who are ethical can go, you know what? I've had these bias experiences, blah, 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 blah. And I know that I need to be mindful of this, that, and the other experiences so that I'm an ethical, competent provider, right? And it's not that rocket science of an experience. Good supervisors can help you see your countertransference, your soft spot, your sore spots, and all these things. And so it's extremely, extremely important for therapists to not become these narcissistic, sadistic voyeurs who just want to help their patients relive their trauma, but never actually do anything with it and grow and individuate and develop more resilience. They just want to like be miserable with you or be on a journey with you or some existential bullshit like that. And the truth of the matter is, some therapists are really good at helping you learn to tolerate yourself. And that might take longer than a couple of months. Some people are so badly traumatized. Some patients are so horrifically destroyed by their childhood or intimate partner violence or whatever it is that they do just need some time to learn to tolerate themselves, which is different than a therapist who's narcissistically trying to help you feel helpless so they can just keep seeing you longer and longer and be your magician Svengali therapist. Those are not the same thing. And so, Roger, let me tell you that when you make these very broad statements, you're missing all sorts of clinical nuances where some people actually are being helped, even though sessions are going longer than you would hope. And some people are not. There are some disgusting narcissists who just love the sound of their own voice. Or they just love to keep you sort of sick and help you stay sick. But then there are also ethical therapists who just want to like move slowly enough so you don't get overwhelmed and fall apart. Right? And so it's complicated. It's hard to tell sometimes if patients are more capable of moving further and quicker. It's not a perfect science, unfortunately. Phil Bradley says, hoorah. I agree, Phil. Jonathan says, homeostasis is real. Also, clients and their context are keeping them in the same ruminative patterns before they present to the therapy room. Supervision should help, as you say here. Absolutely. So many therapists, especially newer therapists, even if you're licensed, I think newly licensed therapists would do really well to have a consultation group to be aware of their countertransference and aware of the patterns of their therapy, because as a therapist, there will be patterns on your end, how you show up consistently across people. There will also be nuances and differences in how you show up across different people. So your job as an ethical clinician is to find your way into those patterns that are consistent across patients. When you find your patterns, then you can be aware of your countertransference, of your biases, of your personality style, of your culture, and your expectations. Those 5 things are not rocket science. They might take a little time and some patience and some good supervision or consultation, but it should not take forever to figure those things out. Okay? So, dear Dr. McFillan, what the fuck? Like, folks, he is pandering to a group of people who are looking to say that therapy is bad and therapists hurt people. And I also believe that therapists hurt people, but it's more complicated than that. I hope that the ways that I've described this so far, you see how complicated it actually is. Because it's very complicated. Finding an actually good therapist who's actually complicated or competent is complicated because not all of them are fully aware of their countertransference, of their bias, and all these things. It's very hard to find competent professionals, but they're out there, and there's more than you think. They're not all narcissists and magicians and Svengalis and sadists who want to keep people sick and make money off of them. Those people definitely exist. So let me say, those people exist, and they're sick, and they're hurting the profession, they're hurting patients. But then there are people who are well-meaning, who are aware of their bias and their countertransference, and they're interested in being voyeurs into people's suffering and vacationing in other people's stories. But that's not therapy. That's self-serving. That's the therapist self-serving their whatever shit. So, anyways, all right. Moving right along. So let's talk about men. So I made a post earlier this week about men. So in the culture wars online, in politics, so on and so forth, there are the great battles of the sexes, of the genders, and all this shit. And the truth of the matter is that it is unfortunately the case that for the last 10 or so years, maybe 15 years, there has been a great deal of anger and frustration towards men specifically, which in many cases is very valid. And so the problem that I face as both a male and a professional, professor, psychologist, consultant, etc., is the experience of having positive male role models and then not having male role models is a world apart. And so there's this psychologist I like, Dr. Cameron Maximus. I don't know what his real full name is, but let me repost my response so you all know what I'm talking about. But anyways, Cam talked about how, a bunch of people are doing these insane, like, competitive male bro things like Tough Mudders and all this shit. And, Cam basically said people are so numb from modern living that they will pay to be abused just to feel something again, even though it's literally pain. The human spirit is not nourished from meaning and connection, will turn to secondary satisfactions like ego and validation. And so my response is people are so desperate for community and accountability. They don't have friends or family anymore to help them grow and be encouraged. And so the thing is, at least in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, this is Patrick, me, not Dr. Lockwood. My personal opinion is this, given how I grew up and the culture I come from, the type of father I have, etc., is this. There is a very important role in life for masculinity, just like there's a very important role for femininity. But right now I want to talk about masculinity. So many people, for whatever reason, sometimes good reasons and bad reasons, do not have access to positive masculine role models, positive male role models typically. And so because of that, they have little appreciation for short-term suffering at long-term gain, for instance, as a concept, or many different types of like prototypically stoic or masculine things out there. It's just that if there is a binary, it seems like a pretty reasonable binary, right? And so the people who don't have that influence on their life often crumble or find themselves looking for these gurus like the Andrew Tates of the world or whatever it is to find their toughness or their ego or whatever it is. And so a lot of people lacked positive masculine encouragement, is what I'm going to call it, PME. And so the idea that you're more capable than you think you are, the idea that you're more resilient than you think you are, you can handle it. You can do it. Like, maybe that's not uniquely masculine. However, it's extremely important and it's missing. It's very much missing in today's society. And I think that historically in this country, in the United States at least, men, generally fathers, etc., have been the role models for that ethos, that you are more capable than you think. You can make it through this experience. Now, to be fair, there are also dozens of awesome female examples of this. Right. One that I think about a lot because this was a film that influenced my childhood specific to me is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. So that's exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about with regard to masculine and feminine, male and female, right? In Willy Wonka, like the Gene Wilder 70s version of it, like you have these shitty male role models who are like laid up in bed, useless Grandpa Joe, basically. And you've got this mom who is like busting her ass as a single mom, washing and doing all these jobs, and Charlie's got a paper route. And she is the one who is encouraging, more so than Grandpa Joe, basically. And so it's the opposite, where you have like a female role model who is more encouraging and in a more what we would think of as prototypically masculine way. And so I can see all the counterexamples for what I'm saying is the short story. But what I really want to say is mentoring, especially mentoring around positive examples of masculinity, is extremely important now more than ever, I believe, especially for male mental health, right? I have more experience clinically, successfully working with males than females. And so based upon my very biased, convenient sample of a life as a male, as a man, growing up with a positive father figure and all these things, working with men professionally for decades, I will tell you this. I'm extremely grateful for having had the male role models in my life, like former supervisors and mentors, my father, current colleagues of mine who are great male role models. And what I'm telling everyone is the world needs positive male role models just as much as we need positive, strong female role models. And so I don't have a lot of lived experience as a female. In fact, I have zero lived experience. So I can't speak on that. I'm not interested in speaking on that. It's not my bailiwick. You know what I mean? So I would like to make an earnest plea to anyone who listens to this. If you are a man, if you're a male, I don't care. Whatever kind of man you are, if you're even kind of feminine, I don't care. Whatever kind of man you are, welcome to the club. You're a dude, welcome. Like, there's something very valuable about being the best man that you can be. It shouldn't be the most important thing about you. So this is not one of those like, men are amazing and being a man's the most important thing you ever do. That's bullshit. But you definitely need to have some positive relationship to your masculinity and to what you bring to the world specifically as a man. Just like you have some hopefully positive relationship to what you bring to the world as a professional in whatever way you're professional. And as an artist, if you're an artist, as a friend, or whatever your roles are, the gender role is just as important as all the other roles. So please, 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 if you are a man, if you're a male, if you're a masculine role model, please go be of service to other guys and be a positive example of what it means to be a man, because the world needs it now more than ever. More than ever now, more than ever. Really. And it's just, you don't have to be a grandiose Andrew Tate piece of shit to do that. You can be whatever you are. So if you're nerdy like me, but you're a helpful male, be that and allow people to see that and allow it to be something useful. Whatever your masculinity is covered by, like Jonathan's saying here, incorporate your gender into the rest of your personality because it matters. It's a big deal. It's not the only thing that matters, but it matters and it's missing. We have these terrible role models who get famous. And I think in order to fight that nonsense, which keeps the culture war bullshit alive, the average run-of-the-mill people who are just decent guys, I wish you guys were louder and better at talking about why you're a valuable influence on the next generation. If you have kids, if you're a teacher, if you're a mentor, if you're in a church, if you're in a club, if you're in Boy Scouts like I was, whatever it is. Jardam says the pre-university education system and the mental health system in the UK is 4-to-1 female. Yes, it's similar here in the United States. And that's why I started this podcast, because I want to be an open, available male influence in the mental health discussion, because most mental health discussions are not particularly male. They're more female, which is totally fine. I love my female colleagues. I think they're fucking awesome. But, you know, the male voices aren't the loud ones anymore. And that's okay. I'm just here to do my part because I think I play a role, just one role, not all the roles. Jonathan says, I don't think we have a very well articulated understanding of the amount of variance there actually is in the larger than expected category of masculinity. There are many interests that can be incorporated into masculinity that aren't necessarily innately masculine or feminine. Right. I think that, not to be too postmodernist about it, there's so many ways to think about the concept of masculinity that has something to do with traditional ideals and roles that kind of serve this gender binary. And then there are some non-gender binary ways of thinking that are also useful, right? And so what I would hope for everyone is that whatever is good about your masculinity, that you show that to the world if you're a dude. And that you allow that to be a helpful, like, role modeling force and influence to people. And if you're in a position where you can be a mentor of some kind, where you can encourage people and allow them to see their gifts and their strengths, please do that. Now, I happen to mentor both males and females in my life, and I love it equally. I just think that very few people in my life that I see in my world here in Southern California have had a lot of positive male influences. So I'm trying to be that for people. And if you also happen to be a male, I hope that you try to do that for people in whatever capacity. If it's in a professional life where you can mentor people in your profession, if it's in your personal life, if it's in your Boy Scouts or your church or social club or bowling league or whatever the fuck you do, just try to be a positive influence. And I think it'll help the world in ways that you can't possibly see right now, but will be very important down the road. So this is a Dear Men pitch. Do your best, you know? And this, by the way, to me includes people that a lot of culture warriors don't like trans men. Like, dear trans men, be the best trans men that you can be. Fucking be your best selves. And I love you and I want you part of the group. I know some people don't, but I do, because I think that if that's what you really are and that's who you really are, then let's fucking go. Welcome to the club and let's do it. You know, let's just do it. And let's make the world better by having the best possible relationships with both masculinity and femininity that we possibly can, so that we can all survive and succeed together. I see a lack of collaboration, and I think that everyone should be at the table collaborating to make life better for us and our communities. So I don't give a shit about the culture wars. If you're a dude from whatever background, from whatever culture, religion, whatever, let's fucking go together. Jonathan says, thinking about Doc Holliday from Tombstone, great movie, by the way. He's an amazing fighter, well-dressed, plays Chopin. Probably appreciates other art forms as well. Many such cases. Yeah, there's lots of different male role models who are not super masculine in every way, shape, or form, because that's normal. There's normal variation. Jardam says, it's a cliche that in a casual encounter, say with a friend, women resolve an issue through conversation and get more out of planning actions, and men get whatever. I don't know. All I'm just going to say is, like, There's room at the table for men of all kinds to be positive role models for masculinity for the next generation and for each other. And we just need more of that because I think the more of us that there are, the less we have to deal with these bullshit people that are rich and famous and nonsensical and narcissistic and actually genuinely toxic and stupid. So, dear men of all kinds, let's get together and make things better for men so that we can be the best that we can be for the society, right? That's my pitch. And that is today's episode. That's all I got for today. There's so much more I could say, but I just wanted to end with that because I think it's kind of a positive thing that there's so much room at the table for great guys, men, dudes of all kinds. And we can be better to each other, with each other, for the world, for each other, you know? So thank you all for coming to chat and hang out and be part of. Appreciate all of you, Jardam, Jonathan, Mountain Girl, etc., Phil Bradley. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And we will see each other next week, and we will do a similar song and dance with hopefully more interesting content if possible. Please like, share, and subscribe. Please share this to anyone that you think needs encouragement around their mental health, criticism about anything I discussed, or just, a more informed perspective. I'm here to help, not hurt. I'm here to encourage, not discourage. So please like, share, and subscribe and help me get the word out. Let's build this thing so that we can help more people get better help. Also, as always, I like to end with a joke of sorts, and so we're going to do that again. So here we go. So I once had this patient, nice guy, kind of more struggling with depression, it seemed like, and he'd been single for about 5 years. So we got together, and he was talking with me about his depression. We did some ACT work and some CBT and some basic stuff that helps. And part of his treatment process was to go out there and just try to randomly date, like not with a lot of guidance and structure, just like put yourself out there, flirt, see what happens, see if you can get a couple of dates. And he did, and he found someone that really liked him. Nice girl. And so they went on a first date, got some coffee, talked. It was fun. He was kind of awkward, but it worked. And he got a second date, which was awesome. And they had a meal and they watched a movie and it was fine. Third date, they went on a hike, which is interesting. And so on this third date, apparently he forgot to wear deodorant and things got kind of smelly. And so she ghosted him. I don't know why she ghosted him, but she ghosted him. Probably because he was smelly. Who knows? But she ghosted him. And so he came back to therapy next week, very sad, very, not depressed, but like just sad situationally. He said, Doc, I don't know what I did. I think maybe I smelled, I'm not sure. And she's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if I'm going to get a date again. I said, sometimes, dating just kind of stinks. All right. See you all. Have a good day. Have a good weekend. Take good care of yourselves. Be good to each other. And I will see you next week.